Some secrets are worn close to the skin, hidden beneath plain wool and a servant's silence. And on the coldest night of that autumn, in the middle of a storm that turned the roads to rivers, one such secret was about to be found by the last man in England who should ever have seen it. Duke Julian Ashworth had not meant to come home that night at all. He had ridden out 3 days before to settle a boundary dispute with the neighboring estate of Lord Harrow, expecting to stay a full week. But the storm changed everything. By the second evening, the sky had turned black as pitch, and the rain came down so hard that the old steward at Harrow Hall begged him to remain until morning. Julian had refused. Something in him, some restless pull he could not name, told him to go home. So he called for his carriage, wrapped himself in his heavy traveling cloak, and set off through the downpour, with only his coachman and 2 tired horses. It was near midnight when the carriage finally rolled through the great iron gates of Ashworth Manor. Lightning split the sky, throwing white light across the stone walls and the dark line of oak trees along the drive. The horses were spent, their coats slick and steaming. Julian leaned out of the window and shouted to the coachman to take them straight to the stables rather than the front court, so the poor beasts might be dried and fed at once. The carriage lurched around the side of the great house toward the courtyard stables, and that was when Julian saw her. At first, he thought his tired eyes were playing tricks. A small figure sat huddled on an overturned wooden crate near the stable wall, half sheltered by the low roof, but still soaked through by the rain that blew sideways in the wind. A girl, a servant, by her plain gray dress and the thin shawl pulled over her head. She was hunched forward, shoulders shaking, and in her hands she held something small and pale. Julian rapped his knuckles hard against the carriage roof. "Stop here." The coachman pulled up. Before the wheels had fully halted, Julian pushed open the door and stepped down into the mud, ignoring the rain that instantly soaked his fine coat and ran cold down the back of his neck. He strode toward the girl, his boots splashing through the puddles. She had not yet noticed him. Her head was bowed, and now he could see what she held. It was a loaf of bread, or what was left of one, dry and hard and half-eaten. She tore a small piece away with trembling fingers and pressed it to her mouth. And she was weeping. Not loudly, not with any sound at all, but the kind of silent crying that comes when a person has learned to hide their grief so no one will hear it. Tears ran down her cheeks and mixed with the rain. Julian stopped a few feet away, and something in his chest tightened at the sight. "Girl," he said, his voice sharper than he intended, "what in heaven's name are you doing out here?" She gasped and shot upright, the crate scraping across the wet stone. The loaf tumbled from her hands into the mud. In her fright, she stumbled backward, and the thin shawl slipped from her shoulders and fell away. "Your Grace," she breathed, dropping into a clumsy curtsy, her whole body shaking now with cold and fear. "Forgive me. I did not know you had returned." "I meant no." "Stand up," he said. "You'll catch your death sitting in this. Why are you not inside by the kitchen fire?" She rose, keeping her eyes down, and did not answer. And it was then, as another bolt of lightning lit the courtyard bright as day, that Julian saw it. At her throat, hanging from a thin cord of leather, was a ring. It had slipped free when the shawl fell. She reached for it at once, quick as a startled bird, and closed her fist around it to hide it away. But she was too late. Julian had already seen it clearly in that flash of light, and the sight of it stopped the breath in his lungs. He knew that ring. It was a signet ring, a gentleman's ring, heavy and old and made of dark gold. And pressed into its flat face was a seal Julian had seen only once before in his life, years ago, in a portrait that had long since been taken down and burned. A rearing stag beneath a crown of thorns. The seal of the Earls of Westfield. For a moment, Julian could only stare. The Westfield name was a ghost in England, a house so ruined and disgraced that people crossed themselves at the mention of it. The old earl had been accused of terrible fraud, stripped of his lands and his honor, and had died in shame. His family had scattered and vanished. Some said they had fled abroad. Some said they had died in the gutters of London. No one truly knew. It had been 10 years since anyone had spoken the name aloud, and now here it was, that cursed seal, hanging around the neck of a kitchen maid in his own courtyard. "Where did you get that?" Julian asked quietly. The girl's face had gone white as bone. "Get what, Your Grace? I have nothing. I have only— Do not lie to me." He took a step closer, and the rain roared around them both. "The ring at your throat. I saw the seal." "Where did you get it?" She said nothing, but her eyes lifted to his for the first time, and Julian felt a strange shock go through him. They were not the eyes of a common serving girl. There was too much in them, too much grief and pride and fear, all tangled together. And under the mud and the rain and the plain gray dress, he saw suddenly that her face was fine-boned and lovely, the face of someone who did not belong scrubbing pots in a kitchen. "Please," she whispered, "please, Your Grace, ask me nothing. If you send me away, I will go tonight and trouble you no more. Only do not ask me who I am." But it was far too late for that. Julian looked at the trembling girl, at the ring hidden in her fist, at the ruined loaf of bread lying in the mud, and he knew with absolute certainty that this frightened maid was carrying a secret that could shake the whole of England. "No," he said softly, "you will come with me, and in the morning you will tell me everything." Clara did not sleep that night. She had been given leave to dry herself by the kitchen fire, and a young footman had shown her to the narrow servants' quarters at the back of the house, but she lay awake on the hard cot, with her heart pounding, until the gray light of morning crept beneath the door. She kept her fist closed around the ring the whole night through, as if letting go of it would somehow make it disappear. She had been so careful. For 3 months, she had kept her head down, scrubbed floors, carried coal, and spoken to no one, and now, in a single foolish moment of weakness, she had ruined it all. Just after breakfast, the head housekeeper found her. "You," the woman said, folding her hands over her apron. "His Grace has asked for you by name. You're to attend the private library and see to the cleaning of it. Personally, he wants no one else about." The other maids in the scullery turned to stare. It was unheard of for the Duke to ask for a lowly kitchen girl by name, and Clara felt their eyes on her back as she wiped her hands and followed the housekeeper up the great staircase. She understood at once what it meant. He had not forgotten. He meant to have his answers. The library was a long room lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound books, with tall windows that looked out over the rain-soaked gardens. Duke Julian stood by the cold hearth in a dark green coat, his hands clasped behind his back. When the housekeeper had gone and the heavy door had clicked shut, he turned to face her. "Sit," he said, gesturing to a chair. "A servant does not sit in her master's presence, Your Grace. You are no servant." His gray eyes held hers. "We both know that. Sit down." Clara's legs felt weak beneath her. She lowered herself onto the edge of the chair, her back straight, her chin high, despite the fear churning inside her. Julian crossed the room and stood before her. "Last night I saw the seal of the Earls of Westfield hanging at your throat. That house has been dead and buried for 10 years. So I will ask you plainly, and I will know if you lie. How does a kitchen maid come to wear the ring of a disgraced earl?" For a long moment Clara said nothing. She looked down at her chapped and reddened hands, the hands of a working girl now, and she thought of her father lying pale and thin on his deathbed, pressing this very ring into her palm and making her swear to be brave. She could lie. She had lied to so many people for so long. But she looked up into the Duke's face and saw that he already knew the truth. and that a lie now would only cost her whatever small mercy she might yet be granted. "Because it is mine," she said quietly. Julian went very still. "My name is not Clara," she went on, and her voice trembled but did not break. "That is the name I took to hide myself. I am Lady Clarissa of Westfield. The old earl who died in shame was my father, and I am the last of my house that yet draws breath." The words fell into the silence of the library, like stones into a deep well. Julian stared at her, and she watched the disbelief war with something else on his face, some flicker of recognition, as though he were finally seeing in her features a thing he could not name. "That is not possible," he said at last. "The Westfield heirs are all dead. It was said the whole family perished. It was meant to be said." Clarissa lifted the ring on its leather cord and let it rest against the gray wool of her dress. "We were meant to vanish so completely that no one would ever ask what truly happened to us. But I did not die, Your Grace. I fled. And I have spent the last 10 years hiding in kitchens and laundries across this country, moving on whenever I feared discovery, keeping only this ring and the truth of who I am." Julian turned away and paced to the window. Rain streaked the glass. When he spoke again, his voice was low. "My father always said the Earl of Westfield was a thief, that he forged records, cheated the crown of thousands of pounds, and brought his ruin upon himself. It was the great scandal of his generation. My father never stole a single coin in his life." Clarissa rose from the chair, and now her voice rang clear and sharp with a lifetime of held-back anger. "He was the gentlest and most honest man I ever knew. He was framed, Your Grace. Every charge laid against him was built upon lies and forged papers. He went to his grave a broken man, wrongly accused, and I swore to him that I would prove his innocence if it took me the whole of my life." "Framed?" Julian faced her again. "By whom? A crime of that scale would take a man of great power and great cunning. Who would go to such lengths to destroy your father?" Clarissa held his gaze, and she felt the whole weight of what she was about to say settle upon her shoulders. Once she spoke this name aloud in this house, there would be no taking it back. "A man who coveted my father's lands," she said. "A man whose estate bordered ours, who had long wished to swallow up our fields and our forests for his own. A man of noble blood and endless ambition, who had the wealth and the connections to forge documents and buy the silence of judges." "His name?" Julian demanded. "Lord Silas." The color drained from Julian's face. He took a step back, as though she had struck him. "Lord Silas Ashworth," Clarissa said, and though it pained her to see the shock on his face, she did not soften it. "Your uncle, Your Grace, your father's own brother, the man who framed my family and stole everything we had, is your own blood." "You lie," Julian breathed. But there was no strength behind the words. "You know I do not. I saw it the moment I said his name. You have wondered, haven't you, about how he came by his fortune, about the whispers that follow him, about the lands he holds that were never truly his." Julian sank slowly into the chair she had left, his face gray as ash. For a long while he said nothing at all, and the only sound in the room was the steady drumming of the rain against the windows. At last he looked up at her, and in his eyes she saw, not anger now, but a dawning and terrible dread. "If what you say is true," he said hoarsely, "then my family's honor is built upon a foundation of another man's ruin, and I have been living in a house of lies my entire life." Julian did not speak for a long time. When at last he rose from the chair, he crossed to a small cabinet, poured himself a measure of brandy, and drank it in a single swallow. Then he set the glass down and turned back to Clarissa. "There is a question you have not answered," he said. "You have hidden in kitchens across all of England, you say. So tell me true, Lady Clarissa. Of all the great houses in this land, Why did you come to mine? Why did you take a position here, in the very home of the man whose blood destroyed your family? That is either madness or design. Which is it? Clarissa had known this question would come. She drew a slow breath. Design, Your Grace. It was no accident that brought me to Ashworth Manor. I came here on purpose, and I chose the meanest position I could find, so that no one would look twice at me. Explain yourself. Before my father died, he told me a secret he had carried for years. She lowered her voice, though there was no one to hear. The charges against him rested upon a ledger, a book of accounts that appeared to show him stealing from the crown's treasury. That ledger was forged. Every figure in it was a lie, written in a clever hand. But my father learned something in his final months, from a dying clerk who had once worked for Lord Silas and wished to unburden his soul. The clerk confessed that he himself had penned the false ledger at Silas's command, and he told my father where it was hidden afterward. Julian's eyes narrowed. Hidden where? Here. Clarissa let the word hang in the air. In this house. In your family archives. That cannot be. Think on it, Your Grace. Where would a guilty man hide the one piece of evidence that could hang him? Not in his own home, where a rival or a servant might one day stumble upon it. He would hide it somewhere no one would ever think to search. Somewhere it would be safe for 100 years. What safer place than the vaults of his brother the Duke, among a mountain of old records that no living soul has cause to open? Julian walked to the window and stood looking out at the gray gardens, his jaw tight. Clarissa could see him turning it over in his mind, testing it against everything he knew. The archives beneath this house hold 200 years of family papers, he said slowly. Deeds, accounts, letters, court records. My father never went down there, nor did I. It is a cold, forgotten place. If a man wished to bury a thing where it would never be found, I confess he could hardly choose better. He turned. But it is a vast collection, Lady Clarissa. Thousands upon thousands of documents. To search it all could take a year. I have been searching it for 3 months, she said. Whenever the household slept, I crept down to the vault by candlelight and combed through as much as I dared before the dawn. I have gone through perhaps 1/5 of it, but it is slow and dangerous work for one person moving in secret and terrified of being caught. Julian looked at her with something close to wonder. You crept alone through a dark cellar in the dead of night, month after month, searching for a book that might not even be there, all to clear a dead man's name. He was my father. Her voice caught. He gave his life to raise me well and love me true, and he died believing the whole world thought him a villain. I could not let that stand, not while there was breath in me. For the first time since she had confessed her name, the hardness in Julian's face softened. He studied her, this slight girl in a servant's gray dress, who had carried such a heavy burden entirely alone, and something in his chest shifted. Come, he said abruptly, show me. He took a candle from the mantel, lit it, and led her from the library down a servant's stair, through a low door, and into a narrow passage that sloped down beneath the house. The air grew cold and smelled of dust and old paper. At the bottom of the stair stood an iron-bound door, which Julian unlocked with a key from a ring at his belt. Beyond it lay the archive vault. It was a long stone chamber with a low arched ceiling, and shelves marched away into the darkness on every side, each one crowded with boxes and bundles and great leather ledgers gone soft with age. Clarissa's small stub of a candle had shown her only a corner of it each night. Now, in the fuller light, Julian saw the true size of the task, and he understood at last what she had been attempting. All this, he murmured. All this, she agreed. And somewhere within it, the proof of my father's innocence and your uncle's guilt. Julian set the candle down upon a wooden table thick with dust. He was silent for a long moment, and Clarissa waited, her heart in her throat, knowing that everything now depended upon what this man chose to do. She had feared he might cast her out. A duke had every reason to protect his family's name, and here she stood, threatening to drag the Ashworth honor through the mud alongside her own. If he wished it, he could throw her from the house this very hour and see the forged ledger burned before she ever found it. Instead, Julian looked at her across the candlelight, and his expression was grave. "If my uncle did this thing," he said, "if he built his wealth and his standing upon the ruin of an innocent house, then he has dishonored the name of Ashworth far more deeply than any scandal could. My father died respecting that man. My whole family bows to him at every gathering. And all the while he has been a thief and a liar hiding behind our name." His hand curled into a fist at his side. "I will not let it stand any more than you would." Clarissa hardly dared believe what she was hearing. "Your Grace, I am offering you an alliance, Lady Clarissa, a secret one, for it must remain hidden from every soul in this house. You know these documents better than I, and you have the reason to search them. I have the keys, the freedom, and the standing to open every door in this estate, without question. Together we may do in weeks what would take you alone another year." He held out his hand to her across the table, as a gentleman might to an equal. "Will you take it?" Clarissa looked at his outstretched hand, and for the first time in 10 long years of hiding and grief, she felt the smallest flicker of hope. "I will," she said, and placed her hand in his. Neither of them heard the carriage wheels that were even then turning through the gates above, bringing an unwelcome guest to their door. The knock came the next afternoon, loud and demanding, echoing through the great hall. Clarissa was in the corridor above with a dustcloth in her hands when she heard the footman swing open the heavy front doors. She heard the rush of wind and rain, and then a voice, deep and smooth and utterly at ease, that made the blood run cold in her veins. "Tell my nephew his uncle has come to call. And be quick about it, boy, before I drown on his very doorstep." She gripped the banister to steady herself. She had not seen that face in 10 years, but she would have known the voice anywhere. It had haunted her dreams. It had spoken the smooth lies that sent her father to his grave. Lord Silas had come to Ashworth Manor. She pressed herself against the wall out of sight and looked down over the railing into the great hall below. He stood dripping upon the marble floor, a tall man near 60 years of age, handsome still, with silver hair swept back and a fine dark coat that must have cost more than a maid earned in 5 years. He handed his sodden cloak to the footman as though the man were a piece of furniture, and looked about the hall with the cool, measuring eyes of one who counts the worth of everything he sees. Julian appeared at the far end of the hall, and Clarissa saw at once the effort it cost him to keep his face calm. "Uncle," Julian said, "this is unexpected. The roads north are washed clean away," Silas replied, striding forward to clasp his nephew's hand. "I was bound for the capital, but no carriage could pass. Yours was the nearest civilized roof, and I knew you would not turn your own blood out into such weather. I shall trouble you only until the storm breaks and the roads dry, a day 2 at the most." "Of course," Julian said, "you are always welcome here." The words came out steady, but Clarissa, watching from above, saw how his hand tightened at his side. She drew back from the railing, her heart hammering. 2 days. 2 days with the man who had destroyed her family, living under the same roof, walking the same halls, while the very proof of his crime lay hidden in the vault beneath his feet. She thought of fleeing that very hour. But if she vanished now, so suddenly, it might draw exactly the notice she had spent 3 months avoiding. She had no time to decide, for a young footman came hurrying up the stairs to find her. "You there, Clara? His Grace wants tea served in the drawing-room for himself and his guest." Cook says you're to carry it, seeing as the parlor maid's abed with a fever. Mind you don't spill." Clarissa's stomach turned over. Serve tea to Lord Silas himself, to sit a tray down before the very eyes of the man who would recognize her ruin in an instant if he only knew to look. But she could not refuse without inviting suspicion, so she smoothed her apron, drew a steadying breath, and went down to the kitchen to fetch the tray. Her hands shook as she arranged the china. She kept her head down, kept her cap pulled low over her brow, and told herself that she was only a servant, one of a dozen faceless girls in gray who came and went unseen. He had no reason to look at her, no reason at all. She carried the tray into the drawing room, where a fire now crackled in the hearth. Julian sat in one chair, and Lord Silas lounged in another, warming his hands. Clarissa moved to the low table between them, keeping her eyes fixed upon the tray, and began to set out the cups with slow and careful hands. "So tell me, nephew," Silas was saying, "how do you find the running of this great pile all on your own? A young man with no wife to help him. You ought to marry. A duke without a duchess is a ship without a rudder." "I manage well enough," Julian answered. Clarissa poured the tea. She felt Silas's presence beside her, like a cold draught, and she willed her hands to stay steady as she filled his cup. And then she felt it. His eyes upon her. Not the careless glance a nobleman gives a servant, but a long, searching stare that lingered and did not move away. "Girl," Silas said. The teapot trembled in her grip. "My lord, look at me." The room seemed to grow very quiet. Clarissa knew she could not refuse. Slowly she lifted her face and met the gaze of the man who had finished everything she loved, and she prayed to God that 10 years and a servant's cap had changed her enough. Silas studied her. His pale eyes moved over her features, her brow, the line of her cheek, the shape of her mouth, and a strange expression crept across his face. It was not quite recognition. It was something more like unease, a puzzle he could not solve, an itch he could not reach. "Have I seen you before?" he asked slowly. "No, my lord." She kept her voice flat and dull, the voice of a girl too simple to be worth a second thought. "I have been in service here but 3 months. Before that I was in Yorkshire, my lord, far from any grand folk." "Yorkshire," Silas repeated, but his eyes did not leave her face. "Strange. You have the look of someone. A woman I knew once, a long while ago." He leaned forward slightly, and the firelight sharpened the lines of his face. The very image of her, about the eyes. Julian spoke, and his voice cut across the room with a lightness that Clarissa knew cost him dearly. "Uncle, you see ghosts in every serving girl. The maid is from Yorkshire. She has told you so. Leave the poor creature be. She has work to do. Girl, you may go." Clarissa set down the pot, dropped a hasty curtsy, and fled the room. It was only when she reached the cold safety of the corridor that she let herself breathe, and found her whole body was trembling. He had seen it. Not the truth, not yet, but the shadow of it. Her mother's face lived in her own, and Silas had known the Countess of Westfield well in the days before he destroyed her. The resemblance had struck him like a half-remembered dream, and Clarissa knew with dreadful certainty that a mind like his would not let such a puzzle rest. He would turn it over and over. He would watch her, and sooner or later he would remember whose eyes those were. Behind the drawing-room door she could still hear the murmur of his voice, and though she could not make out the words, the low and thoughtful tone of it frightened her more than any shout could have done. Time had just grown very short. Whatever she and Julian meant to do, they would have to do it before Lord Silas finished solving the riddle of her face. They waited until the house was dark and silent. Julian had made certain of it. At supper he had pressed a second and a third glass of wine upon his uncle, spoken of dull estate matters until Silas's eyes grew heavy, and at last bid him a warm good night. He had listened at the guest chamber door until he heard the deep, even breathing of a man fast asleep. Only then did he go to fetch Clarissa. They met in the grand study, just past 1 o'clock in the morning. It was a room Julian's father had used for the estate's most private business, and its shelves held the great bound account books of the Ashworth family, reaching back many years. Julian had realized something that afternoon that had changed the whole shape of their search. "We have been thinking of it wrongly," he told her, keeping his voice low as he lit a single shielded candle. "You have been searching the old vault, and rightly so. But consider, if my uncle hid the ledger here, he did not simply toss it upon a shelf. He is far too careful for that. He would have placed it among documents of the same kind, where it would sit unnoticed, like a single black sheep in a great flock. A false ledger would be hidden among true ledgers, and the true ledgers of that year are not in the vault below. They are here, in this study." Clarissa's eyes widened. "Then all this time I have been searching the wrong room. Perhaps. Let us find out." They set to work. Julian drew down the account books from the year of the Westfield ruin, and the 2 years on either side of it, and they spread them across the great desk. The candle threw a small pool of gold light, and beyond it, the study lay in shadow. Outside, the rain had at last begun to soften to a steady drizzle. They worked in silence, turning page after page of cramped figures and faded ink. Clarissa found she could read the old accounts far more quickly than Julian, her eyes flying down the columns, and he watched her with growing respect. "You read these as easily as a letter," he murmured. "My father taught me his figures before I could read my letters," she said, not looking up. "He said a lady who cannot keep her own accounts is a lady at the mercy of every steward who chooses to rob her. I did not understand then why he taught me so. I understand now." An hour passed, and then another. The candle burned low, and then Clarissa stopped, her finger resting on a single line. "Here," she breathed. "Look here." Julian leaned close. She was pointing to an entry in one of the Ashworth ledgers, a note of a payment made to a name he did not recognize, a Mr. Ambrose Pike. "Pike," Clarissa whispered. "That was the clerk, the dying man who confessed to my father. He was Silas's clerk, and here is a payment to him, made from your family's accounts, in the very month my father was accused." Her hands trembled with excitement. "But that makes no sense. Why would money pass from your family's coffers to a clerk in your uncle's service? Unless your uncle used your father's accounts to move the coin, to keep his own hands clean." "There is a mark beside the entry," Julian said, frowning. "A small symbol, there in the margin. I have seen it elsewhere in these books, always beside entries that seem to lead nowhere." Clarissa studied the little mark, a curl and 2 dots, and slowly the color rose in her cheeks. "It is a cipher," she said. "My father used ciphers of this very kind. A private key to mark which entries were true and which were flags to point him toward hidden pages. This mark means there is more to be found. It points somewhere, to another book, or another page." She looked up. "Where are the ledgers this symbol appears in? Bring them all." Julian gathered them, 4 heavy volumes, and Clarissa spread them side by side. She found the little mark in each, and beside each mark a small number that seemed to mean nothing on its own. But when she laid the numbers together in the order the books were dated, a pattern rose up out of the confusion. "They are shelf marks," she said, her voice rising with wonder. "Not page numbers at all. He has left himself directions, a map through his own hiding place, so that he might one day retrieve what he hid, without having to remember where he put it. Julian, these numbers point to a shelf, and a place upon it." She read out the numbers, and Julian crossed the study to the tall shelf against the far wall, counting along the rows. His fingers came to rest upon a plain gray ledger, wedged tightly between two others, unremarkable in every way, its spine worn and its cover unmarked. He drew it out and carried it to the candle. Together they opened it. For a moment neither of them breathed. The book was a ledger of the Crown's treasury accounts, or so it appeared, filled with figures showing vast sums, drawn out under the hand and seal of the Earl of Westfield. It was the very evidence that had ruined Clarissa's father, the proof that had branded him a thief before all of England. But it was a forgery. Clarissa knew it in an instant, and she pointed with a shaking hand to show Julian how she knew. "There," she said. "The date. This entry is dated the 12th of March, and it bears my father's seal. But my father was in Bath that entire month, taking the waters for his health. He could not have signed this. 100 witnesses saw him there. And here, look at the hand. It is meant to be my father's writing, but it is copied. See how the letters are drawn slowly, carefully, the way a forger copies, not the way a man writes his own name in haste." Tears stood in her eyes. "This is it. This is the false ledger. This is the proof that Silas made it all and hid it here in his brother's house so that no one would ever find it." Julian stared down at the book that had destroyed one family and enriched another, and his face was grim in the candlelight. 10 years, he said quietly. "For 10 years this has sat upon my father's shelf, and every day my uncle walked free while your father lay disgraced in his grave." He closed the ledger carefully, as though it were a living thing that might escape. "We have him, Clarissa. This book will hang him." But even as he spoke, they both knew the danger had only grown. A cornered man is a dangerous man, and Lord Silas slept but a few doors away. If he should learn what they had found before they could bring it before the law, he would destroy it, and them, without a moment's mercy. Clarissa looked at the ledger in Julian's hands, and then at the gray light beginning to touch the windows. "Then we must move quickly," she said, "before he wakes." Julian did not sleep at all that night. He sat in the study, with the forged ledger, locked in the drawer of the great desk, and he thought. To hold the proof in his hands was one thing, to use it was quite another. If he confronted his uncle here, alone in this country house, Silas would simply deny everything. He would call the ledger a forgery of Julian's own making, or he would find some way to seize it and cast it into the fire before any honest witness could see it. A man of Silas's cunning would not be trapped by mere evidence produced in private. He would have to be caught where he could not wriggle free, before eyes too many and too powerful to be silenced. By the time the sun rose, Julian knew what he must do. He found Clarissa in the corridor with her dust cloth, keeping up the pretense of her duties, and he drew her aside into an empty morning room. "We cannot expose him here," he told her quietly. "In this house, it is his word against ours, and he is a lord of high standing, while you are a maid and I am his own nephew, who might be thought to have some quarrel with him over inheritance. No court would hear us. We need a stage he cannot escape, a room full of the greatest and most respected men in England, magistrates and peers, where the truth can be laid bare, before too many honest witnesses for any lie to cover it." "And where might we find such a room?" Clarissa asked. "The capital. I keep a town mansion there, and each autumn I host a gathering of noble peers to mark the close of the fiscal year. It is a grand affair, attended by lords and judges and men of the first rank. I shall announce that I am departing for the capital at once, to prepare for it, and I shall bring the ledger with me, and you as well. But how am I to travel? A kitchen maid does not ride in a duke's carriage." "You will travel as my personal attendant," Julian said. It is a common enough thing for a great household to bring a trusted servant to town. No one will question it. Once we are in the capital, I will find a way to set the trap. But we must go now, this very morning, before Silas grows any more suspicious of your face." The plan was sound, and Clarissa agreed to it. But no plan survives its first meeting with the enemy, and theirs began to unravel before the carriage was even loaded. Julian announced his departure over breakfast, saying only that pressing business called him to town and that he must go at once. He expected his uncle to remain behind at the country house or continue on his own delayed journey. But Silas set down his cup and smiled a slow and knowing smile. "How fortunate," he said. "For I too was bound for the capital before the storm turned me aside. The roads should be passable now. I shall travel with you, nephew. Your company will make the miles pass quickly." Julian's stomach dropped, but he could not refuse without cause. To object to his own uncle sharing his carriage would raise exactly the suspicion he was trying to lull. So he inclined his head and said that nothing would please him more, while inside he cursed the ill luck that now forced them all into one small moving box for the length of a long day's journey. They set out mid-morning, the three of them, once the trunks were strapped and the horses harnessed. Clarissa sat beside the coachman at first, as befitted a servant, but the drizzle soon turned to a hard rain, and Julian, mindful of the ledger hidden in a false bottom of his own traveling case, could not risk her catching a chill and falling ill before they reached the capital. He called her down and bid her ride inside with them, seating her opposite, in the corner, with her eyes lowered. And so began the most wretched hours of Clarissa's life. The carriage swayed and jolted along the rutted road, and within its close and shuttered walls she sat within arm's reach of the man who had finished her family, forced to keep her face turned to the window and her hands folded meekly in her lap. Silas sat directly across from her. She could feel his gaze return to her again and again through the long, dark hours, that same searching, puzzled stare, and each time it settled upon her, she felt as though a spider were crawling slowly up her spine. Julian did his best to hold his uncle's attention. He spoke of the coming gathering, of the peers who would attend, of the fine wines he had laid in, and the matters of estate he wished to discuss. But Silas answered him in half-sentences, distracted, his mind plainly elsewhere. And always his eyes drifted back to the silent girl in the corner. "Tell me, Clara," Silas said at last, some hours into the journey, and Clarissa's heart nearly stopped to hear him use the name. "You said you came from Yorkshire. Whereabouts exactly?" "I know the county well. I held lands there once." "Near Ripon, my lord," she said, giving the answer she had rehearsed 100 times. "A small village. Your lordship would not know it." "And your people, your mother and father?" "Dead, my lord. Of the fever, when I was small." "Ah." Silas leaned back, but his eyes did not leave her. "A pity. And yet you carry yourself uncommonly well. For a village orphan, there is something in the way you hold your head. Something bred, not learned." He tilted his own head, studying her as a man studies a painting he suspects to be a copy. "I have known ladies of the highest birth, with worse posture. It is a curious thing." "You flatter me, my lord," Clarissa murmured, keeping her voice dull and flat. "I am sure I do not know what you mean," Julian broke in sharply, steering the talk toward the state of the roads, and Silas allowed himself to be turned aside. But Clarissa saw that the seed had taken deep root in his mind now, and that with every passing mile he came closer to the answer that would doom them all. The carriage rolled on through the wet gray countryside as the light began to fail. Clarissa fixed her eyes upon the passing hedgerows and the dripping trees, and counted the miles in her heart, and she prayed only that they might reach the capital before Lord Silas finally remembered where he had seen her mother's eyes. Beside her, Julian's hand rested upon his traveling case, where beneath a false panel the forged ledger lay hidden, the whole of her family's redemption sealed in a plain gray book that a single spark could destroy. They did not speak again for a long while. There was nothing safe left to say. And so the three of them rode on toward the capital in silence, each of them holding a secret, and each of them knowing that in the days to come, one secret or another was certain to be laid bare. The capital swallowed them whole. After the quiet of the country, its streets roared with the rattle of carriages over cobblestones, the cries of street sellers, and the endless press of people. Julian's town mansion stood in a fine square lined with tall houses, its windows already ablaze with candlelight when they arrived, for the servants had been warned by a rider sent ahead and had thrown themselves into readying the house for the great gathering. Silas was given the finest guest chamber and departed to rest and dress, leaving Julian and Clarissa a rare moment alone in the library. "The gathering is 2 nights hence," Julian told her, his voice low and quick. "Every peer and magistrate of note will be here. It is the perfect stage. But I have been turning the plan over, and I see now that we must change it. I meant to keep you as a servant, hidden among the household. That will not do." "Why not?" "Because a servant has no voice in such a room. If I bring out the ledger, and my uncle denies it, calls it forgery, who will speak for its truth? A kitchen maid who steps forward with a wild tale will be laughed out of the house and thrown into the street. Silas will paint you as a mad woman or a thief, and no one will hear a word you say." Julian began to pace. "No, you cannot be a servant in that room. You must be a lady." Clarissa stared at him. "You mean to present me as a noblewoman, before a hall full of the very people who would remember the Westfield scandal? It is madness. Someone will know my face, as your uncle nearly did. Your uncle nearly knew your mother's face, because he knew her well, but she has been gone from society for a decade. The younger lords and ladies never met her at all, and I will not present you as a Westfield." He stopped and faced her. "You will come as Lady Clarissa Hartwell, a gentlewoman of a distant province, lately arrived from the far north, and known to few. It is a small enough lie, and it will give you standing in that room. It will make you a guest, not a servant, and a guest has every right to speak. When the moment comes, you will not be a maid pleading for mercy, you will be a lady presenting the truth." It was a bold and dangerous stroke, and Clarissa's first thought was to refuse it. To stand in the light before all of society, after 10 years of hiding in shadows, felt like stepping willingly onto a scaffold. But she saw the sense in it. A voice in that room was everything, and so, with her heart in her throat, she agreed. The 2 days that followed were a whirl of quiet preparation. Julian sent for a dressmaker known for her discretion, and in a locked room away from Silas's notice, Clarissa was fitted for a gown finer than anything she had worn since she was a child. When at last the evening of the gathering came, and she stood before the looking-glass, she scarcely knew herself. The gown was of deep midnight blue silk, cut in the fashion of the day, with a high waist and a low, square neckline, trimmed in fine ivory lace. Her hair, so long hidden beneath a servant's cap, had been dressed high and threaded with a string of borrowed pearls, with soft curls falling against her cheeks. Gloves of white reached past her elbows, and beneath it all, hidden against her heart on its leather cord, she still wore her father's signet ring, the one true thing amid all the borrowed finery. She looked like exactly what she had been born to be, a lady. The great rooms of the mansion had been thrown open, and the conservatory ballroom at the heart of the house blazed with the light of 100 candles in crystal chandeliers. Palms and orange trees in great pots stood among the guests, filling the warm air with the scent of green things and beeswax. A small ensemble of musicians played from a gallery above, and the floor was crowded with the very cream of English society. The gentlemen in dark coats and the ladies in silks of every color, all of them laughing and murmuring and turning their sharp and curious eyes upon one another. Julian met her at the foot of the grand staircase. He was dressed in black and silver, and when he saw her descend, something moved across his face that he did not trouble to hide. "Lady Hartwell," he said, and offered his arm. "You will forgive me. I had thought you handsome as a maid. I find I had no notion at all. Do not make me laugh, Your Grace," she whispered, taking his arm to steady her trembling hand. "I fear if I laugh I shall not stop, and they will all know me for a fraud at once. You are the truest thing in this room," he said quietly. "Remember it. Every soul here wears a mask of one kind or another. You alone have earned the right to wear yours." He led her into the ballroom, and heads turned as they entered. A murmur ran through the crowd, that soft rustle of interest that greets an unfamiliar and lovely face. Julian moved among his guests with easy grace, and at his side Clarissa walked with her chin high and her back straight, all those years of her mother's teaching rising up in her now when she needed them most. She curtsied to a marchioness, exchanged a pleasant word with an old baron, spoke of the roads and the weather and the beauty of the conservatory, and slowly the terror in her heart gave way to a strange and heady wonder. They believed her. Not one of them looked at her and saw a kitchen maid. They saw a lady, because a lady was what she truly was. Across the room, Julian caught sight of Lord Silas, resplendent in dark green, holding court among a knot of magistrates and elder lords. Silas had not yet seen her. Julian meant to keep it that way as long as he could, to let the evening ripen, to gather the most important men close before he sprang the trap. But fate, as ever, had its own designs. Silas turned, quite by chance, to take a glass of wine from a passing servant, and over the rim of it his gaze fell upon the girl in midnight blue standing at his nephew's side. And this time there was no cap to shadow her face, no dull servant's manner to disguise her. This time she stood in full candlelight, dressed as her mother's daughter, her head held high, and her mother's very eyes shining out of her face. Julian watched it happen. He saw the glass halt halfway to Silas's lips. He saw the color drain from the older man's face, and then rush back into it, dark with fury. He saw the terrible dawning of understanding as 10 years fell away in a single heartbeat, and Lord Silas at last remembered exactly whose eyes were looking back at him across the crowded room. Silas set down his glass, and with slow and deliberate steps, his face a mask of cold rage, he began to walk toward them through the crowd. Lord Silas cut through the crowd like a blade through silk. The nearest guests fell quiet as he passed, sensing the storm in his face, and by the time he reached them, a small circle of watchers had gathered, drawn by the scent of something about to happen. "You," Silas said, his voice ringing out clear across the ballroom. He pointed a long finger at Clarissa. "I know you now. I could not place you these 3 days past, but I have it at last. I never forget a face, and I never forget the look of a liar." The music faltered in the gallery above. The murmur of the crowd died away. All around them the guests turned to look, and Clarissa felt 100 pairs of eyes settle upon her. "My lord," she said evenly, "I fear you are mistaken. We have not been introduced. Have we not?" Silas turned to address the crowd, spreading his arms wide, playing to the very magistrates and peers Julian had gathered. "My lords, ladies, hear me. This woman who stands before you, dressed in silk and pearls, this so-called Lady Hartwell of the northern provinces, is no lady at all. She is a scullery maid, a kitchen servant from my own nephew's country house. I have seen her carrying tea and scrubbing floors with these very eyes not 3 days since." A gasp ran through the crowd. She has crept into this fine company under a false name, dressed above her station, to deceive you all. Ask yourselves what such a creature intends. She is a thief and a fraud, and I would wager she means to rob every honest guest in this room before the night is out." The whispers rose to a roar. Clarissa felt the eyes upon her turn from curiosity to suspicion, and her heart pounded so hard she feared it would burst. This was the very ruin Julian had warned her of, a maid dressed as a lady, exposed before all of society. In another moment, they would seize her and cast her into the street, and no one would ever hear the truth. Silas saw the crowd turning and pressed his advantage, his lips curling. "Well, girl, have you nothing to say? Or shall I have the magistrates send for the constables and see you clapped in irons where you belong?" Clarissa opened her mouth, though she hardly knew what she would say. But before she could speak a word, Julian stepped forward, and his voice cut across the room like a bell. "That will not be necessary, uncle." Silas turned to him, still riding the crest of his triumph. "Nephew, I know it grieves you to be so deceived under your own roof, but you must see this fraud for what she is. Do not let a pretty face blind you. Have her taken away." "A fraud?" Julian repeated the words slowly, and there was something in his calm that made the older man's smile falter. "Yes, let us speak of frauds, since you have raised the matter before such distinguished company. Let us speak of forgery, and of a good man ruined by a lie." He raised his voice so that every soul in the great room could hear him. "My lords, magistrates, honored guests, you know me, you know my name and my honor. I ask you now for a few moments of your attention, for a grave wrong is about to be set right in your presence tonight." The room fell utterly silent. Julian nodded to a footman who stood waiting by the wall, and the man came forward, carrying a small wooden case. Julian opened it and drew out the plain gray ledger, holding it up for all to see. "10 years ago," he said, "the Earl of Westfield was accused of stealing from the Crown's treasury. He was disgraced, stripped of his lands and his honor, and he died a broken man, his family scattered, and his name a byword for treachery across all of England. You will all remember the scandal. What you do not know is that every charge laid against him was a lie." A ripple of shock moved through the crowd. Silas had gone very still. "The evidence that ruined him was this ledger," Julian went on, "a book of accounts showing the Earl drawing vast sums under his own seal. But the ledger is a forgery. I hold in my hand the proof of it." He turned the book toward the 2 chief magistrates who stood near the front, grave old men whose word carried the weight of law. "Observe the entry dated the 12th of March. It bears the Earl's seal, yet it is a matter of record, witnessed by dozens, that the Earl of Westfield was taking the waters at Bath throughout that entire month, and could not have signed it. Observe the hand. It is not written, my lords. It is copied, slowly and carefully, in the manner of a forger, tracing another man's name." The 2 magistrates came forward and took the ledger. They bent over it, and Clarissa watched their faces darken as they read. "And who forged it?" Julian said, and now at last he turned to his uncle. "The book was found hidden in my family's archives, tucked among the true ledgers, marked with a private cipher so that its maker might one day retrieve it. That same cipher marks a payment, drawn secretly through my father's accounts, to a clerk named Ambrose Pike. Before his death, Pike confessed under oath that he penned this false ledger at the command of the man who paid him. That man coveted the Westfield lands. That man had the wealth and the cunning to forge a nobleman's ruin and hide the proof in his own brother's house, where no one would ever think to look." Julian's voice rang out. "That man stands before you now, my uncle, Lord Silas." The room erupted. Silas's face twisted, and he took a step back. Lies. This is a fabrication. A plot cooked up by this scheming girl and my foolish nephew to steal my good name. Then how does the girl come to bear this? Said Clarissa. She reached up and drew the leather cord from beneath the lace at her throat, and lifted the signet ring high, so that the candlelight caught the gold, the rearing stag beneath the crown of thorns, the seal of Westfield. I am no scullery maid, my lord, she said, and her voice did not tremble now. I am Lady Clarissa of Westfield, daughter of the Earl you destroyed, and the Countess whose eyes you finally remembered tonight. I have carried this ring for 10 years, while I hunted the truth through the kitchens of England. And here it is, at last, before the highest men in the land. One of the magistrates held the ring against the seal, impressed upon the ledger's forged pages. They matched. The proof was complete, laid bare before too many honest and powerful witnesses for any lie to cover. Silas looked wildly about him, at the hardening faces of the peers, at the 2 grim magistrates, at the nephew who had trapped him, and the girl who had outlasted him. He had walked into the very snare he thought he was setting, and the whole of society had watched him do it. Seize him, the elder magistrate said quietly, before he flees. And strong hands closed upon the arms of Lord Silas as the great room roared. 2 days later, the storm had passed, and the capital woke to a clear autumn sky. The gardens behind Julian's town mansion had come alive in the morning sun. Late roses climbed the old brick walls, and the gravel paths, washed clean by weeks of rain, gleamed pale between beds of asters and chrysanthemums. Bird song filled the air, where for so long there had been only the drumming of the downpour. It was as though the whole world had been scrubbed fresh and set out to dry in the light. Clarissa walked among the flowers in a gown of soft gray silk, no longer borrowed, but her own. So much had changed in 2 short days that she could scarcely believe it was real. The matter had moved swiftly once the magistrates had seen the ledger and the ring. Lord Silas had been taken from the ballroom that very night and held under guard, and by the following morning, the great men of the law had convened to examine the evidence in full. The forged ledger, the cipher, the secret payment to the clerk Pike, the sworn confession the dying man had left behind, and the perfect match of the Westfield seal against the false pages, all of it together made a case that no amount of wealth or noble standing could talk its way past. The judgment had come down that very morning. Lord Silas was stripped of his titles, his honors, and every acre of land and every coin of fortune he had built upon his crime. The estates he had stolen from the Westfields were ordered returned, and the name of the Earl of Westfield, so long a byword for treachery, was cleared before the highest court in the land. It was written into the record for all of England to read. The Earl had been an innocent man, wronged and disgraced by the greed of another, and his honor was restored to him and to his house. Her father's name was clean at last, 10 years too late for him to know it, but clean. Clarissa had wept when she heard the words read aloud, standing in the great hall of the court in her fine gray gown. She had wept for her father, who had died believing the world thought him a villain, and for her mother, whose eyes she carried, and for the frightened girl who had scrubbed floors and slept in cold garrets, and eaten stale bread in the rain, all so that this day might come. And then she had dried her eyes, for the weeping was done now, and something new had begun. She found Julian waiting for her by the old sundial at the heart of the garden. He turned as she approached, and the morning light was kind to him. "They tell me the deeds are already being drawn up," he said. "The Westfield lands will be restored to you within the month. The house, the fields, the forests, all of it. You are a lady of your own great estate once more, Lady Clarissa, and a wealthy one. You need never carry a coal scuttle again as long as you live." "It hardly seems real," she said softly. She looked down at her hands. The redness of the scullery had begun to fade from them already. For 10 years, I have thought of nothing but this, of clearing his name. And now that it is done, I find I do not quite know who I am meant to be. I have been Clara the maid so long that Lady Clarissa feels like a gown that no longer fits. It fits you well enough, Julian said. Better than it has any right to, given all you have endured. She smiled at that, but there was something wistful in it, and Julian saw it. You are troubled, he said. You have won everything you fought for. What is it that weighs on you still? Clarissa was quiet for a moment, turning her father's ring upon its cord where it still hung at her throat, for she found she could not bring herself to take it off even now. I am thinking that I must leave, she said at last. The lands are mine again, and there is a great deal to be set in order after 10 years of neglect. 100 people depend upon that estate, and it has wanted a master for far too long. It is my duty to go and take it up. She looked away toward the roses on the wall. And yet I confess, I go with a heavy heart. It is a strange thing. I came to your house a stranger with a secret, meaning to use you if I could, and to slip away the moment I had what I needed. I never thought to find a friend in the nephew of the man I hated, and now that it is time to part, I find I would give a great deal not to. Julian was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was low. Then do not, he said. She turned to look at him. I have thought of little else these 2 days, Julian went on. I have watched you these weeks, Clarissa. I have seen your courage, and your wit, and the sharpness of your mind, and the grace with which you bore a burden that would have broken a lesser soul. When you cracked my uncle's cipher in the dead of night, I knew I had never met your equal, man or woman. And when you stood in that ballroom and held your father's ring aloft before all of society, with your head high and your voice steady, I thought I had never seen anything so fine in all my life. He paused. I do not ask you to be my maid, nor my attendant, nor anything beneath you. I ask you as an equal. Stay near me. Let us set your estate in order together, and mine besides. Let this thing between us, which began in a downpour over a stale loaf of bread, become something true. Clarissa's heart was full. She thought of that first terrible night in the rain, weeping alone with her secret, certain she was the loneliest creature in all the world, never dreaming that the man who found her would become the one who set her free. You once told me, she said, that every soul in that ballroom wore a mask of some kind, and that I alone had earned the right to wear mine. Do you know, I think I am done with masks. I have worn one for 10 long years, and I am weary of it. I should like for once to simply be myself, and to be known. Then be yourself, Julian said, and be known. I should like nothing better than to know you, all the days of my life. She looked up at him in the clear morning sun, and for the first time in 10 years, Clarissa felt the last of the old fear and grief loosen and fall away from her heart, like a shawl slipping from her shoulders. Her father's name was clean, her family's honor was restored, and here before her stood a man who had chosen justice over his own blood, and who now offered her not pity nor charity, but a place beside him as his equal. Yes, she said simply, and the word felt like the first free breath she had drawn in a decade. I should like that very much. And in the sunlit garden, with the roses blooming on the old brick walls and the long storm finally behind them, the maid who had wept alone in the rain and the duke who had found her began, together, the rest of their lives.